So we've spent a lot of time talking about Jim Minery for the Alaska Family Council and the Protect Your Rights group and how he kind of maybe affected things a little bit during the botched municipal elections. Another big name out there, as is always in Alaska politics, is Jerry Prevost of the Anchorage Baptist Temple. Mel Green from Bent, Alaska, knows a thing or two about Jerry Prevost and has had one of probably the most significant roles, I think, of anybody in Alaska state history covering Jerry Prevost, especially recently.
Okay.
And you know, he always likes to poke his head out around election time and kind of wield the power of the evangelical fundamentalist, independent fundamentalist Baptist community. Tell us about why we may want to think twice before we're taking his word as scripture, pun intended.
Well, taxes.
They happen.
Yeah, they happen. And I've been subject to a certain amount of being the red herring in the situation. Here, a red herring being throwing an argument off track, distracting people's attention by getting them to focus elsewhere, because I am with Bent, Alaska, and I'm the person who broke the story about the irregularities with taxes that just last week resulted in a municipal tax assessor declaring that Anchorage Baptist Temple owed $61,000 in back taxes. And I think that figure has been revised somewhat downwards to something like $58,000 now, but...
Oh, well then it doesn't matter.
Oh, yeah. And really what that came out of, because what Prevost's big red herring when that story came out, not when it first came out, I first broke that story in August. Coincidentally, about 3 hours later or so after I posted my story, the judge in the divorce case of Alan Prevost, Jerry Prevost's son, was closed by the judge. And then it took a bit of time for the Anchorage Daily News to sue to get the file reopened. They ran a big story in January, and at that point Jerry Prevost said, oh, this only ever comes up when quote, special rights for homosexuals comes up, because they want to keep me from speaking out. Well, of course, I'm a homosexual.
Breaking.
So it's all my fault. I was part of a conspiracy, as was the Anchorage Daily News, as was anyone else who covered it. And we only brought up taxes in order to shut Prevost up. Well, the facts are a little bit different from that. The fact is that I had no idea at the end of August that the One Anchorage campaign was going to be announced at the time that it was. But coincidentally, it just turns out that Alan Prevost filed and gained his divorce, and that we got an anonymous tip that there was something hinky in his divorce files, and thus we discovered that there were questions around some members of the Anchorage Baptist Temple having secret agreements to get equity in the houses that they lived in that were supposedly fully owned by the Anchorage Baptist Temple, which is the only thing that gave them tax exemption.
Well, Prevost, speaking of red herring, Prevost has referred to basic human and LGBT rights as special rights, as you said. Now, firstly, why do you think he would use this tactic? And secondly, what special rights has he used in his current tax situation?
You mean why would he use the term special rights?
Absolutely.
Because it's a red herring, and that's a red herring that has been used nationwide by the religious right in describing equal rights, equal protection from discrimination under the law for LGBT people.
And as we all know, Paul Jenkins pointed out that their rights are already covered as spelled out in the Declaration of Independence, so we really should stop wasting our time. We're going to talk about some reforms when we come back.
I grew up in Anchorage. I registered to vote for the first time in Anchorage. I, because of going to school in other places, have not been able to vote in every election. But I was able to vote in the early voting process, which I'm really glad that we have in this city. And I think my vote got counted. But all of that aside, I'm just turned 23. I have a whole lifetime of voting in front of me, and I have so many friends who think that voting doesn't matter, who don't vote. I am the anomaly with people my age. And when I say, no, there's so many elections in Alaska that have been decided by hundreds of votes, or 100 votes, or 50 votes, and I say, it's so important for you to go vote, how can I use that argument when it's not even going to be counted? Literally, it's not being counted. And I think that you're seeing a huge outpour from the city of concern that this is not okay. And if you say that it's okay, then I will actively, there's a bunch of you who I support on this assembly, but I will actively be involved in revoking all of you because my voice is being taken away when you decide not to investigate this. And it's so important, and it's not right. And I know that we're all coming forward and really imploring you to give our voice power and to really count our votes, but it seems like, why should I even have to stand here and ask you all to do your civic duty, to respect my vote, and to make sure that if this had been an election where assembly members were being elected, I bet that you guys would really want to know if you really won or if you really lost.
That was Laura Herman, an Anchorage resident, testifying in one of the rare opportunities where citizens who were affected by this election were allowed to testify before the assembly. And she highlights my biggest fear going out of this, which is we already are in a decline of voter turnout. You're operating with local elections where there's reduced turnout within that context. Josh, you had said that you even had talked to at least one person who didn't even vote this time.
Yes, I have met one member, keep in mind, just one member of the LGBT community that didn't bother voting in this previous election. The young person openly said that they didn't think that their vote would count at all, and that when it comes to political situations, they'd really just rather not bother. If you had an opportunity to talk to this young person, how would you tell them how important their voice is to actually get people to get up and make these decisions?
I would, for one thing, I was there at the assembly, and the only testimony that was allowed was you had to wait all the way to the end of every meeting.
Right.
That was the only way.
Like 10:30 at night.
And it was amazed how many people waited.
Yep.
And her testimony hit me really hard, and because I completely understood what she was saying. And all I can tell people is that the very smartest thing they can do is stay in touch with their assembly people. I cannot emphasize how much people's emails to their assembly person in their district makes a difference. And it doesn't,
write that down.
And it doesn't take that many. It doesn't take that many emails to get an assembly person's attention. It really doesn't. And they're the ones who are in charge. The assembly itself is actually in charge of this election. They are in charge of the municipal clerk's office. So if your voice is shared with the assembly person, you have a voice in how your elections are taken care of. Right. Number one. I can also reassure people that the work of the recount group has made a difference very much. They have taken the people that are looking at doing a rewrite of Title 28 are using our recommendations from our report. Those are the recommendations they're using for the rewrite. I can also I'm very encouraged that this report has been taken to the legal folks at the municipality, that the municipal attorneys are looking at this, and there is a push by the assembly to actually sit down and count the names on the register, which is probably one of the best ways to see and compare that number to the ballots that were cast. I don't know how that will end up, but that's there. But things are happening as a result. There are things happening. And the very best way for people's vote to count is for them to stay engaged, to keep their elected officials honest.
Can I add something to that?
Please. Yes.
There was another person who stayed to the very tail end of an assembly meeting in order to be allowed to testify. Very first assembly meeting after the election, and he was talking about voter turnout. He said something like 28% of the electorate and I would say that would be registered voters, are who decided these questions that were on the ballot for everybody. It's not in the best interest of the people, of many of the people in power, to have high voter turnout, because their whole thing is to stay in power, and to do that they keep the people who keep them in power happy. And the people who keep them in power are the 50% plus one of the people who actually turn up at the polls and vote. Now, obviously, we want to make sure that your vote actually gets counted, which we don't know happened this time, but we also need to show up. We also need to register ourselves before we can show up. So all of that stuff really counts. If you don't want the powers that be to maintain that power, register, show up, be part of that 50% plus one.
Yeah, the only excuse you have to not vote is if you're running, and then it's kind of stupid if you don't vote for yourself. So it is one of those things, and we're out of time, but we have to be vigilant. I want to thank Josh Kokai, who's on, Linda Kellen Biegel. You can find her work at themudflats.net, and you should. Same with Mel Green, bentalaska.com. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Please send your emails and thoughts, comments, objections, etc. alaskacommons@gmail.com. We'll be back here next week. Thank you very much. Live local. We'll talk to you then.